Hello, and welcome to Sonata She Wrote. This video is an analysis of the first movement of Mozart's G minor string quintet, K516. I'm going to be analyzing every movement of this work, and the reason I chose it is because each movement is either a particularly dramatic form, as is the first movement and the minuet and trio which follows, or a specific type of sonata form which we see less often, like the third and fourth movement. Unfortunately, the piece is just too big to be all in one video, but all of it should be released within the next 2 weeks. This quintet, along with its sibling in C major, represents a shift in Mozart's composition away from a focus on public performance, like the piano concertos, and toward a probably more lucrative, or at least hopefully more lucrative, focus on publishing. This shift was probably ushered in by the success of his group of 6 quartets dedicated to Haydn. Any of Mozart's 4 string quintets are masterpieces of Mozart's late career. So without further ado, let's get into the first movement. Just in this first statement of the primary theme, there's a lot to unpack. The theme is 8 bars long and has a half cadence at its midpoint, marking the phrase structure as a period. I know I haven't discussed phrase structure before, so very quickly, and to oversimplify, there are 2 phrase types. The first, a period, is made of alternating basic and contrasting ideas. A period typically has a half cadence at the end of the antecedent, the first half of the phrase, and an authentic cadence at the end of the consequent, the second half of the phrase. The other phrase type is a sentence, a phrase structure which, to define it in opposition to the period, has no midway cadence. It is more often comprised of a basic idea, a response to that idea, motivic fragmentation, and finally a push towards the cadence. Obviously, phrase types get much more complicated than this, and there are several subtypes and even combination types. If you want more information, the theorist Seth Monahan has a video on his channel, which I'll link in the description. Back to the Mozart, what we have here is a period, or rather, an attempt at a period. Although all the parts are here, this music isn't able to reach an authentic cadence at its end. Presumably, it's this failure which causes the lower strings, formerly silent, to spring into action. They repeat the phrase, but with some additional effort at the end. The repetition here turns a simpler 8-bar phrase into a much grander affair. We might now retroactively consider the first 4 bars a basic idea, the next 4 a contrasting idea, and so on. But there's a problem with viewing this as a 16-bar period as well. The same problem which occurred in the first 8 bars, which is that unfortunately, the lower strings can't reach a cadence either. Like many pieces, the small-scale struggles of the primary theme in this quintet are representative of many of the issues in this sonata form. Obviously, the struggle to cadence is nearly always present in sonata form, but beyond that, this separation, or dialogue, between the high and low voices, with the first viola often torn between them, will often reoccur in the form and the piece. As the music aborts the idea of a cadential phrase structure, which is its choice, the strings make what feels very much like a misstep. The first bars of the P-TR merger, which is also the first moment here where all voices sound simultaneously, opens with a brief tonicization of the minor 5, which you may remember is the least desirous tonal choice for a secondary theme. The music recovers, however, and makes a beeline for a tonic PAC. Yikes. This is probably the last cadence we'd want a medial caesura to articulate, and the music responds by attempting to reject the proposed tonality. Although the music reopens the transition, Mozart is tonicizing the major six. It's fully decades before Beethoven. At the time of composition of this quintet, Beethoven was a young chap of 17, and Schubert, who didn't exist yet, would make this into a normative option. And so, unfortunately, the music collapses back into the tonic minor and again articulates a medial caesura in that key, meaning that in addition to the burden of reaching cadence, the secondary theme now bears the full responsibility of modulating into a new key. The secondary theme is overworked and underpaid, and unfortunately, it refused to join its trade union. Fortunately, the secondary theme does manage to modulate after a few dicey bars, but look at the apparently oppositional tacks that the first violin and cello are taking. The first violin's melody, if it had no accompaniment, could almost be in B-flat major from the outset, going back and forth between a 1 and a 4 chord in that key. But the accompaniment in the lower voices refuses to budge. When they finally do agree to modulate into the major mediant, it's now the first violin that's out of step, emphasizing G on the downbeat here and outlining a G minor chord for 2 more bars. After a brief disintegration, the secondary theme regathers itself and just misses the cadence. The first violin is apparently not ready to move on. In my video on the essential closures, I briefly examined another piece by Mozart, his piano sonata in A minor, where he used a similar tactic to this quintet. He used repeating imperfect authentic cadences to highlight the difficulty of reaching the essential expositional closure. The problem with this technique used in this quintet, and also in the A minor sonata, is that it gives the initial impression of sonata failure. The themes which follow each cadence point sound more and more like closing zones, even if they are, more accurately, as I've labeled them, simply sections of the secondary theme. So, there are 2 possible interpretations here, and I think both are valid. The first is that these IACs are simply a technique of dramatizing the struggle to reach PAC, and that each iteration is simply a new section of the secondary theme. The other option is that this first IAC is the essential closure, and it is a failure. A further piece of evidence in favor of this view is actually the reappearance of the P theme. You may have noticed that this exposition's closing zone is P-based, but where does the closing zone begin? We can see motivic chunks of the P theme appearing as soon as the first cadence in B-flat major. This is unusual, but not impossible. In the Elements of Sonata Theory, Hepokoski and Darcy mentioned that by far the most common type of interaction with S and P is a P-based secondary theme, which we've encountered before, but that sections of the primary theme occurring within a distinct secondary theme may have separate interpretations. In all of these cases, however, the commonality is that the secondary theme is struggling to reach structural closure. Note that they end this paragraph by pointing out how this can appear as a premature appearance of the material reserved for the closing zone, which is used to direct the push toward an EEC. But what if this material is not pushing for an EEC, but actually is closing zone? So, is this expository failure, or simply a case of try again? Deferred success is still success, after all. One thing's for sure, though. This exposition? Now that's what I call sonata theory. The music which follows the closing zone, a retransition, leads back into the repeated exposition. When moving into the development, however, Mozart extends the section, which has the effect of dispersing the tonality. Initially tonicizing C minor, a deceptive gesture where a dominant G major chord resolves to A flat major scatters any sense of tonality. Considering the scale of the piece, the development is relatively short, probably comprising only 10 to 20% of the piece. Initially, Mozart begins with a developmental statement of the P theme, before a brief caesura leads us into S material. Hearing the secondary theme in minor, which isn't too unusual in a development, always gives me the sense of someone popping into the room as devil's advocate. Now hold on, let me just advocate for Satan for a second. Maybe the secondary theme would sound good in the minor mode. How are we going to know if we don't try? Although initially the primary theme and its tonality seemed weak, unable to cadence even after 2 attempts, we know the gravitational pull of the key is strong from the deformative tonic PAC medial caesura, and the development quickly makes its way back there with a brief retransition. Much of the recap has close correspondence with the exposition, so I'll just draw your attention where it diverges, and the first place it diverges is the second iteration of the primary theme. I've mentioned before that the primary theme in the recap often emphasizes the subdominant, but Mozart sometimes goes a step beyond that, either opening the P theme in that key or modulating to it before transitioning back into the tonic. He's opted for the latter in this second statement of the P theme. He modulates into C minor and merges into a transition at an earlier point in the theme. At the point of rupture in the secondary theme in the exposition, which served to highlight the asynchronous high and low voices of the quintet, Mozart has done the same. If we look at the cello line in bars 184 and 85, this bass line out of context would appear to be in B flat major rather than G minor, or the opposite of how it appeared in the exposition. The cello has actually been avoiding even a whisper of the tonic from 175 all the way to 200, which is the piece's first attempt at a structural close. The trend from the exposition continues. First, in bar 201, the first violin misses the tonic. Then in bar 207 and 8, the cello drops out and fails to instigate a motion from dominant to tonic, all behind a backdrop of the repeated motifs which opened the primary theme. Finally, all the parts do reach cadence, and probably at this point not a surprise, it is in the dreaded minor mode. Although the exposition did barely manage to achieve a structure of promise, the recapitulation has failed in its quest, and Mozart has given us the tragic minor mode structural cadence. But the piece is not over. A discursive coda follows this section. A discursive coda is a longer than usual tag on the end of a movement, and, similar to a shorter coda, it typically serves as a commentary on the form which just happened, and this is no exception. Although a long coda is very unusual for Mozart, this practice would become increasingly common and dramatic as the 18th and 19th centuries continued. This coda gives the impression of a fourth full rotation. All the excess material is trimmed away, and the slowly fading music is suddenly ended with a hammering cadence. This sonata form is a type 3, or textbook sonata form, albeit a very dramatic one. Up next is a minuet in trio, equally dramatic, and the third and fourth movement are two less commonly heard sonata types. I hope you enjoyed this analysis, and I hope you'll check out the other movements when they're available, which should be very soon. If you'd like to support the channel and keep these analyses and lectures coming, please consider donating any amount to my Patreon at patreon.com/sonatashewrote. And as always, please leave any questions or comments you have below, and I'll respond as best I can.